people that I have talked to this last 2 weeks say the penalties in PJM for non-performance under their capacity market program are far less than the financial incentive to perform that we have with a $9,000 price cap. So, Larry, I respect what you said. You held my hand through the California energy crisis when I was the baby regulator going up to FERC and facing the firing squad. But, I do want to keep our powder dry until we see exactly what it was that caused the 158 plants not to perform.
Pivot a little bit about ERCOT. The fact that is, proud Texans, we like the fact it's isolated from the rest of the nation. But do you think if we were interconnected with the rest of the nation as far as ties, do you think that would have helped? And Michael and Larry, feel free to chime in.
1,000 or 40, whatever number we want to take, how you count the wind, shortfall in generation, 2 or 3 gigs through ties, AC or DC, would have been nice to have, but not change the narrative. We've got about 1,000 megawatts of interconnection to the east and to Mexico today. There's a pending project that Southern Cross that would connect 2 gigawatts more developers, but there are plenty of ways to do more interconnection to the outside. I should say, Becky, we like to save us. There's nothing un-American about that.
And I would say that in Texas, we like to export oil and refined products and biofuels in the form of wood pellets and natural gas. We export every form of energy except electrons. Why do we make them separate for electrons? So I would say the interconnection, even if it's just a few gigs, it doesn't stop the outages, but it means the depth of the outages are not as bad. It might give enough slack that you could actually rotate the outages. We didn't have enough slack, so the outages were kind of frozen in place. And if you were on, you were on. If you're off, you're off. It wasn't rotating the way it was in 2011. So if we can borrow power from other states, that would help just enough to maybe give a little more flexibility in the system. And by the way, those other states were having their own winter storm and didn't have a lot of excess power, so it would have put pressure on the whole system. But I like the idea of interconnection because we could export clean solar, wind, or geothermal electrons, whatever it is, 99.9% of the time for a handsome profit, and then 0.1% of the time prop each other up with reliability, either one way or the other. So I like the idea of interconnection, especially when we have some that aren't subject to the FERC authority. We could probably do a little more and get a lot of the economic reliability benefits. So I'm really curious about that. I think it's worth looking into.
Yeah, I think that, Michael, that's right. I think there's, in the cost of DC, the infrastructure itself has come way down a lot from the 2 that are done back in the 70s. One of our sister companies at Hunt built a DC tie to Mexico about, 15 years ago. And that was much, much lower cost to build that than the original 2 were. So those ties work. Certainly to the west, it would be great to get some of the wind out to the west, but also to pull in from the west. We don't have really anything substantial connecting Texas to the western interconnect. We do have a couple doing the east and to Mexico.
Any idea of how much interconnect Texas can do before it hits some kind of FERC jurisdictional borderline?
I have no idea. I mean, when I was there, the issue was, did it comply with the Federal Power Act? And yes, you have it meets the Power Act, that it doesn't change jurisdiction, and so you just move forward and approve a DC tie. If you had AC ties, I think that would be different. That regulatory fiction was adopted years ago in the 70s and has been held and actually locked into federal law. So I think if you build it, they will come. I mean, build the interconnections and they'll come. We were actually required in '95. The Texas legislature required that a independent study be done of the interconnection of Texas at AC to Louisiana and to the eastern power grid down there, and it was proven that it would have required a substantial rebuild of the whole east side of Texas, that transmission grid, because power flows, once you open it up to AC and they're not controlled through DC technology, that would flow and change a lot of it would burn out a lot of the existing transmission. So we'd have to rebuild that. And the view was that and the conclusion from that panel was that the cost of interconnection did not justify the expense. That's 25 years ago. So certainly worth thinking about that again. But, having been on both sides of that regulatory divide, I can tell each side, the other side's not so bad. FERC's view of markets is very similar to ours. God knows does control the reliability oversight in the whole country.
It's true that more interconnection might have helped somewhat with this reliability challenge, but it's not likely it would have been the solution. As Pat said, it's not clear that the costs and benefits, would make it logical to do. But I think the reality is that ERCOT is a big enough power system that it ought to be able to have the investment to make it reliable against the kind of winter cold snap that we just experienced. All and too isolated. It's big enough. The problem is that we didn't have the investment that was needed to make a power system like this reliable. And Pat brought up the natural gas issue. One of the lessons from the other power systems that have the capacity markets, when they had the polar vortex a few years ago, what they found was they were paying people for available capacity. And when the polar vortex hit, the generator said, well, my capacity is available. There's nothing wrong with it. I just don't have any fuel. And so what they learned was they have to be very specific when they define what do we mean when we're paying you for firm capacity. And so they changed the rules, and what it did was it created the penalties and rewards that Pat talked about, and we've seen more people now firm up their fuel supply. And one of the biggest ways that you create greater reliability, a natural gas-fired power plant is a gas turbine. It can run off of a liquid fuel. If you have...
we might want to just say that's a requirement. If you have a gas plant, you've got to have dual fuel. That was that was one thing that did work well under the old regulated days.
This is above $1,000, 12 hours a year. And that was the high point across the past 5 years. Ability that everybody needs in the wintertime.
And ISO New England does actually uplift that as
other mechanisms. And that's what I think it says. The market monitors that we have need to be doing reliability assessments and saying, look, at the market outcome we've got right now isn't giving us the investments and reliability that we need. We are too exposed to a winter cold snap. Here's the kinds of changes we need to make in order to make sure we've got a system that looks like the way it ought to.
A great job to pull all the generation out of the closet. That also allows a lot of price responsive demand to back out of the demand. All in January and February. So we design a system great for the summer, but are we really focusing on these, 1 in 10 year events?
And it needs to change. Do you have any thoughts about